Good morning, boys and girls. Welcome back for our final two chapters from Magic Tree House number 24, Earthquake in the Early Morning by Mary Pope Osborne. And I always say this on the last day. Leo always says, I think I heard him. He said, it's Jack and Annie time. All right, chapter 9. Jack and Annie had just gotten back to Frog Creek Woods, and they're ready to start Chapter 9, The Wonderful Room. The songs of early morning birds filled the woods. Jack opened his eyes and sighed. They were back in Frog Creek. He could breathe again. His eyes didn't sting anymore. He was wearing his own clothes, even his sneakers. I wonder what happened to everyone, Annie asked anxiously. Andrew, Peter, and their aunt, and Betty and Fred, and all the other people. Jack pulled out his research book. He turned to the last chapter and he read aloud. After the earthquake fires were put out, people from all over the world sent help to San Francisco. The brave citizens of the city never gave up hope. Many even wore badges that said, "Let's rebuild it once." In less than 10 years, San Francisco was once again one of the loveliest cities in the United States. So even back then, people were reaching out to help others. Oh, good, breathed Danny. Yeah, do you have our sign? Jack reached into his pack. He pulled out the sign from Peter and Andrew. He placed it on the floor next to the list from the Civil War, the letter from the Revolutionary War, and the slate from the Pioneer Schoolhouse. We have all 4 writings now, he said. So what happens next? Asked Annie. Suddenly there was a roar. A bright light flashed through the treehouse. Jack covered his face. When he peeked over the top of his fingers, he saw Morgan Le Fay. Morgan! Jack and Annie cried joyfully. They both hugged her. Morgan hugged them back. We found the 4 special writings for your library, said Jack. Annie picked up the list and the letter. Jack picked up the slate and the sign. Here they are, he said. They started to give everything to Morgan, but she held up her hand. Do not give them to me, she said. Someone else needs them. Suddenly, a blinding light flashed through the treehouse again. There came a great roar, then silence. When Jack and Annie opened their eyes, they were no longer in the magic treehouse. They were standing in a huge, shadowy room. The room smelled wonderful, like leather, books, and a wood-burning fire. Flames crackled in a huge stone hearth. Along the walls were rows and rows of tall bookcases filled with books. Welcome to my library, Morgan said softly. Wow, Jack whispered. Someone here is waiting to meet you, said Morgan. I told him that 2 very special messengers would arrive soon. Where is he? Asked Annie. Morgan pointed to a man dressed in dark blue in a corner of the library. He sat in a chair. His head was bowed, and his hair was black streaked with silver. He looks tired, Annie whispered. Yes, he and his knights have been defeated, Morgan said quietly. He has given up all hope for his kingdom. How can we help him? Asked Annie. Morgan looked down at the special writings that Jack and Annie held. Would it help if we showed him these? Jack asked. Morgan smiled. Come on, let's show him, said Annie. They crossed the room and knelt before the tired-looking man. Excuse me, Annie said softly. The man looked up. He had sad gray eyes. We're Morgan's messengers. We've come to help, said Jack. The man shook his head. I don't understand, he said in a deep, tired voice. You are children. How can you help? Oops, there we go. Sometimes children can help a lot, said Annie. Jack and I helped a general, and we helped wounded soldiers. We helped people caught in an earthquake and a twister, Jack added. The man straightened up a little. "That is quite brave," he said. "We want to share how we did it," said Annie. She held up a list from the Civil War. "This tells how we helped wounded people," she said. She held up the letter from the Revolutionary War. "And this tells you that even when things look their worst, you shouldn't give up," she said. Jack held up the slate from the Pioneer Schoolhouse. "This says, if at first you don't succeed, try again," he said. Then Jack held up the piece of wood from the San Francisco earthquake. "And this says that when you've lost everything, you can still have hope," he said. The man studied the 4 special writings. Then he looked at Jack and Annie with piercing gray eyes. "You were both very kind to find these things and bring them to me," he said. "Are you magic?" "Oh, no," said Annie. "Morgan is magic. We're just ordinary kids." The man smiled. He seemed less sad and weary now. "And I am just an ordinary king," he said softly. "So I suppose if 2 ordinary kids can find courage and hope, then an ordinary king can find it too." The man slowly stood up. "I will now go and speak to my knights," he said. "I will share the wisdom that you have brought me." He wrapped his cape around him, and he bowed to Jack and Annie. "Thank you," he said, and he strode bravely out of Morgan's library. "Yes, thank you," said Morgan, walking over to Jack and Annie. "You're welcome," they said. "These are for your library," said Jack. He and Annie gave Morgan the 4 special writings. Morgan smiled. "Their wisdom will help many readers who come here," she said. "Great," said Annie. "It's time for you to go home now," said Morgan. Jack looked around Morgan's library. He hated to leave. It was the most wonderful place he'd ever seen. "Don't worry, you can come back," said Morgan, reading his mind. "You must come back, for you both have helped save Camelot. Goodbye for now." Before Jack and Annie could speak, there was another blinding flash. Then they were home again in the treehouse in Frog Creek in the early morning. It was an interesting chapter. Chapter 10, The Mystery of Morgan's Library. "I can't believe we took a trip to Morgan's library," said Annie. Jack smiled and nodded. "It was incredible, wasn't it?" said Annie. "Yeah," said Jack. A strong breeze gusted through the treehouse window. It blew open their research book about San Francisco. Annie reached for the book. "Jack," she said, "look at this." She pointed to a photograph in the research book. It showed a boy and a girl covered with dirt. The boy held a sign. It was the poem about hope. Annie read the caption aloud. This is the fact part. "After the earthquake, while fires raged through the city, 2 brave children tried to give hope to others." You know what picture I'm going to show you? This was the picture in their research book. And the sign says, "There was no water and still less soap. We have no city but lots of hope." Annie laughed. "Those brave kids are us," she said. "That's the picture Fred took of us before we left San Francisco." Jack smiled and shook his head with amazement. Annie closed the book. "I guess we are 2 brave kids who try to give hope," she said. "We just gave some to King Arthur, didn't we?" "King Arthur?" said Jack. "Yes," said Annie. She started down the rope ladder. "That was the mystery of Morgan's library. We had to find 4 special writings for King Arthur so he could get his hope and courage back and save Camelot." "That wasn't King Arthur," said Jack. He threw on his pack and followed Annie. Sure it was, said Annie, stepping onto the ground. Didn't you hear him say, I'm just an ordinary king? Get it? King? But King Arthur's not an ordinary king, said Jack. Well, he thinks he is, said Annie. I know it was him. I feel it. She smiled. Then she started through the Frog Creek woods. Jack started after her. King Arthur? As birdsong filled the early morning woods, Jack thought about their visit to Morgan's library. He remembered the sad king and how their writing seemed to give him strength. Maybe Annie was right. Maybe they really had helped King Arthur save Camelot. And maybe someday they would go back. Hurry, Jack, Annie called, before Mom and Dad wake up. Coming, Jack shouted, and he took off running after her, running for home. Finally. And that's the end of Magic Treehouse number 24, Earthquake in the Early Morning by Mary Pope Osborne. And again, I want to thank Landon for sharing 21, 22, and 23, and 24 with us. But before I close for today, interesting that these were real things that went on in history, because as I've been reading things over the last few weeks, it's very odd that in this book they talked about Clara Barton. And oddly enough, in one of my magazines, it pictured famous stamps that have been made through history. And this one right here, if I can get it in the picture correctly, this one is a stamp to commemorate Clara Barton. And it said she founded the Red Cross, which the Red Cross helps people every day, blood drives, people that need food in case of emergencies, hurricanes, earthquakes, anything. So, oddly enough that I saw that stamp that commemorates Clara Barton. Some real history from Civil War on Sunday. A next interesting little fact, remember the Revolutionary War? This was George Washington, and he gave that famous speech yesterday just in our local paper. Of course, this picture came out, which again, we talked about that famous picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware. Well, this was made for our times now. So we have people going to the grocery store, actually Schnucks, in a shopping cart with the American flag, and the words say, "These are the times that try men's souls." So again, and last but not least, I have my little necklace on today that says Hope, H-O-P-E, which was the theme from the last book we just read. So, the one thing I noticed at Schnucks today, which is a little like the sign that Jack and Annie found. I love this. Someone had made this for the workers at Schnucks, and it says, "Thank you, workers. Columbia appreciates you." So, I thought that was a great way to end today, boys and girls. That just look around and there's all kinds of signs of hope everywhere. So, have a great weekend. I don't know what I will start to read next week because remember, after I read 4 books, then I read a new chapter book. So, you all have a great day. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.